You're listening to the Audiobook Vault. Enjoy the stories and be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Beneath the Empire by James Sinclair. Prologue. The Price of Desire. Charlotte Sinclair has it all. The perfect life, a wealthy husband, and a world of luxury at her fingertips. But when her husband's estranged younger brother, Julian Carter, returns to town, everything Charlotte thought she knew about love and loyalty is thrown into chaos. Trapped in a cold, loveless marriage to billionaire real estate mogul Victor Sinclair, Charlotte yearns for something more. What begins as a spark of attraction for the enigmatic Julian soon ignites into an irresistible, forbidden passion. But Julian isn't just a handsome, charming escape. He carries a dark, vengeful secret from the past. As their affair grows more intense, so does the danger surrounding them. Long-buried truths resurface, and Charlotte is forced to confront choices that could destroy everything she holds dear. Julian's return isn't just about love, it's about revenge, and the price may be more than they can bear. In The Price of Desire, passion collides with betrayal in a high-stakes game where desire and vengeance blur the lines of right and wrong. Will you love to be enough to survive the scandal? Or will the consequences prove too costly to bear? Chapter 1. Beneath the Surface. Charlotte Sinclair stepped onto the balcony of their penthouse suite, her gaze sweeping over the glittering skyline of the city. The lights below twinkled like 1,000 stars, reflecting the life she had built with her husband, Victor Sinclair. It was a life most women would envy, a life of wealth, opulence, and status. Yet, as she stood there, her fingers curled tightly around the railing. She couldn't shake the emptiness settling deep in her chest. Her marriage to Victor had always appeared perfect to the outside world. He was a billionaire real estate mogul, known for his sharp business acumen and polished exterior. Charlotte was his perfect match, a poised, elegant socialite who graced charity galas, art exhibitions, and high society parties. They were a power couple, admired by all. But beneath the glamorous surface, their relationship had long since withered into a hollow shell. Victor was absent, physically and emotionally. His long hours at the office and constant business trips meant their time together was reduced to brief, detached moments. At night, when they did share a bed, it was more out of routine than passion. Charlotte had come to accept the loneliness that accompanied her life. She was a trophy wife in every sense of the word, her only purpose to look beautiful and accompany her husband to his social obligations. But as she stood there now, feeling the cool breeze kiss her skin, Charlotte realized she couldn't remember the last time she had felt truly alive. Everything had become so predictable. Victor's constant business meetings, his late nights, the lavish dinners with clients, the endless cycle of appearances. Charlotte was beginning to feel like a forgotten piece of the grand design. Charlotte? The deep, rich voice of her husband pulled her from her thoughts. Victor appeared behind her, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit. He was the picture of perfection, as always. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his sharp jawline exuded authority. He walked toward her with that confident stride she had once admired, but now it only made her feel more distant from him. "What is it?" she asked, her voice betraying none of the turmoil swirling inside her. "I've been thinking about our next move," Victor said, his tone smooth and detached. "We have a dinner with the Carter family tomorrow night. I need you to look your best." Charlotte nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. The Carters were an influential family in the city, powerful, well-connected. Victor's business dealings required him to maintain strong relationships with such families, and Charlotte was always the perfect accessory. But lately, even the thought of mingling with the elite felt exhausting. "I'll be ready," she said softly. Victor kissed her cheek, a gesture so perfunctory it felt more like a habit than affection. "Good," he murmured before turning to leave. "I'll be in my office if you need me." As the door clicked shut behind him, Charlotte exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Alone again. The silence of their home pressed in on her. For a fleeting moment, she closed her eyes and let herself imagine what it would be like to break free, to escape from this cage of luxury and loneliness. But where would she go? What would she do? She had everything, and yet nothing. A sudden knock at the door snapped her from her thoughts. Frowning, she turned toward the sound. Who could it be at this hour? "Come in," she called out, curiosity lacing her voice. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped into the room. Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. It was Julian, her brother-in-law. He stood there, framed in the doorway, looking every bit the man she had heard about, but never truly known. His dark hair was longer than most men's, tousled in a way that gave him a slightly rebellious air. His stormy eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall away. "Julian," she murmured, her voice barely audible. He hadn't changed much since the last time she saw him, years ago, before his estrangement from Victor. He was still the same dangerous, enigmatic figure, and as always, there was something about him that made Charlotte feel both intrigued and uneasy. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Julian said, his voice low and smooth like velvet. "I just wanted to say hello. It's been a long time." Charlotte's heart fluttered unexpectedly. There was something in his tone that sent a ripple of excitement through her, even though she knew she shouldn't feel this way. He was forbidden, off limits. Her loyalty was to Victor, her husband. But Julian wasn't just any man. He was the one person who had been absent from her life in the most tantalizing way. And now, with him standing before her, something inside Charlotte stirred. "No, you're not disturbing me," Charlotte replied, forcing a smile. She stepped forward, trying to steady her breath. "It's good to see you, Julian." He smirked, a knowing look crossing his features as he stepped further into the room, closing the door softly behind him. "You're looking well," he said, his eyes scanning her with an intensity that made her skin tingle. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady, despite the sudden rush of heat flooding her senses. A charged silence stretched between them, the air thick with unspoken words. Julian's gaze never wavered, and Charlotte couldn't tear her eyes away. A strange magnetism, an undeniable pull, drew her toward him, despite knowing she should resist. "What brings you here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper as the tension grew. Julian's lips curled into a small smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just thought I'd check in on you. It's been too long since we've had a proper conversation." Charlotte's pulse quickened. She was sure he was referring to more than just small talk. Something deeper, something darker, lurked beneath the surface, and she could feel it in the way his presence filled the room. "I'm glad you stopped by," she said, unable to keep the unease from her voice. As Julian moved closer, Charlotte's breath hitched. Something told her this was only the beginning. Chapter 2. temptation. The following evening, Charlotte found herself once again in the grand ballroom of the Carter family estate, surrounded by the glittering elite of society. Her designer dress, an intricate lace creation in deep crimson, clung to her curves like a second skin, her long blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon. Yet, despite the lavish surroundings and the compliments she received from those around her, Charlotte felt utterly out of place. Victor had been preoccupied with business discussions with several of the other guests, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She made polite conversation with the wives of Victor's colleagues, though her mind kept drifting back to the encounter she'd had with Julian the night before. She couldn't help it. His words, his smoldering gaze, the way he seemed to look right through her, it was all too much. She hadn't expected him to visit her so soon after their brief meeting in the penthouse, nor had she anticipated the jolt of desire that had surged through her when their eyes met. The connection had been instant and undeniable. Yet it was dangerous, so dangerously forbidden. He was Victor's half-brother, and that fact alone should have been enough to make Charlotte back away, to run as far as she could from the magnetic pull Julian had on her. But she hadn't run. She hadn't even tried. Now, as she scanned the room for Victor, she saw him in conversation with a group of men, his eyes cold and calculating as always. It was a look she had grown accustomed to over the years, the look of a man too absorbed in his own world to notice what was happening in the one around him. Charlotte. The voice, smooth and rich with an undeniable edge, broke through her thoughts. She turned, and there he was, Julian, standing across the room with that same intense gaze, the same subtle smile that hinted at secrets she longed to uncover. "Julian," Charlotte said, her voice softer than she intended. She forced a smile, but it felt strained. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." Julian's eyes gleamed with something unreadable. "I could say the same about you, Charlotte," he replied smoothly, walking closer. His presence felt overwhelming, intoxicating, like a storm she couldn't escape. "I'm just here with Victor," she said, her words automatic, though her pulse raced. "We were invited, of course." Julian nodded, his gaze flickering toward Victor before returning to her. "I know," he said, his voice laced with something dark. "I saw him earlier. He's as charming as ever, isn't he?" Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" Julian's smirk deepened, but there was something else in his expression, a flicker of bitterness that quickly vanished. "Oh, nothing. I suppose I'm just used to seeing him in a different light." Before Charlotte could ask him to elaborate, Julian's hand gently brushed against hers as he moved to stand beside her. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a rush of heat through her veins. She barely managed to suppress a shiver. "You're looking stunning tonight," Julian said, his voice barely above a whisper. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "But then again, you always do." Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. The compliment was nothing new, but the way he said it, so intimate, so charged with something unspoken, made her feel like she was the only person in the room. "Thank you," she replied, her voice a little breathless despite herself. She tried to focus, to steady her emotions. This was just a friendly conversation, nothing more. But then Julian took a step closer, closing the small gap between them, and Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. "Why is it?" Julian murmured, his eyes locked onto hers with intensity, "that every time I'm near you, I can't help but feel like I'm drowning?" Charlotte's pulse quickened, and a wave of heat spread through her body. His words were like a challenge, a promise, a confession, all at once. She could feel the pull, the magnetic force between them, and no matter how hard she tried to fight it, it was becoming impossible to ignore. Charlotte began, but her voice faltered, trapped between fear and desire. She took a step back, needing space, needing air. "Don't be afraid, Charlotte," Julian said, his voice like silk as he followed her, his presence unwavering. "I'm not here to hurt you." Charlotte looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you want, Julian?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to sound composed. "Why are you really here?" He paused, his eyes scanning her face as if he were searching for the right words. "I'm here because I've been gone too long," he said softly, his gaze unwavering. "And because you're everything I never thought I could have. You're more than just a perfect socialite wife, Charlotte. I see you for who you really are. And that's why I'm not going anywhere." Charlotte's breath hitched, and her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the back of a nearby chair for support. His words, his gaze, they rattled her in ways she couldn't explain. "Julian," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a mix of confusion, fear, and something else. A longing that had been buried deep inside her for far too long. "This can't happen." His lips curved into a faint, almost sad smile. "I know it can't, Charlotte, but that doesn't mean it won't." The air between them thickened, and for a moment, it felt like time stood still. The ballroom around them faded, and it was as if they were the only two people in the world. The temptation to give in, to surrender to what was brewing between them, was almost unbearable. Just then, the distant sound of Victor's voice broke through the tension, calling her name from across the room. Charlotte stiffened, her pulse racing. She quickly stepped back from Julian, forcing a smile back onto her face as she turned toward her husband. "I should go," Charlotte said, her voice suddenly cold and distant. She looked at Julian one last time, her heart pounding. "Excuse me." As she moved toward Victor, she couldn't help but feel Julian's gaze on her back, searing into her like a brand. She knew then that this was only the beginning of something she couldn't resist, no matter how hard she tried. And deep down, she didn't want to. Chapter 3. A Dangerous Pull. Charlotte had always prided herself on her self-control, rigid, polished armor she had perfected over years of carefully curating her life. She was composed, well-mannered, the perfect wife to a successful, albeit distant, husband. But over the past few days since Julian's return, that control was slipping away, thread by thread. She spent the next morning at the estate, walking through the meticulously manicured gardens while her mind wandered. She had tried to push Julian from her thoughts, telling herself that their brief interaction was nothing more than an uncomfortable fluke, a moment of weakness, no more. But every time she closed her eyes, his face haunted her. The way his lips had almost brushed her ear when he spoke to her last night. The weight of his gaze. The way he made her feel alive in a way Victor never did. She tried to focus on her surroundings, the lush greenery, the soft chirping of birds, but everything faded into the background whenever her mind returned to Julian. Why had he come back? What did he want from her? She could feel that he was more than just an enigma. He was a man on a mission, driven by something far deeper than just curiosity or simple affection. There was an intensity in his eyes that made her uneasy, as though he knew exactly what he was doing like he was playing a game she wasn't sure she could win. "Charlotte?" The voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to see Victor standing at the entrance to the garden. His sharp suit and perfectly combed hair were the epitome of success, and for a moment, she felt the weight of her actions press against her chest. He hadn't noticed the distance growing between them, had he? "Victor," she replied, trying to mask the unease in her voice. She turned toward him, offering a smile she didn't quite feel. He didn't smile back, his brow furrowing as he looked at her with mild concern. His fingers tightened briefly around the cuff of his sleeve, a small, unconscious gesture he always made when something unsettled him. "Is everything all right? You've been distracted lately." Charlotte forced herself to look at him, to try to find the connection that had once been so effortless. She wanted to care for him, to love him as a wife should, but all she could think about was Julian, his touch, his words, the way he seemed to see right through her. "I'm fine," she lied. "Just a little tired, I suppose. It's been a long week." Victor nodded, though he didn't seem entirely convinced. "Well, don't let it get to you. We have that gala next weekend. You'll need your strength." His words felt automatic, rehearsed, as though he was trying to make up for the emotional gap that had long existed between them. "Of course," Charlotte replied, her smile tight. "I'll be ready." But as she turned to walk back inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was changing. The life she had built with Victor, the calm facade she had maintained for so long. It all felt so fragile now, like it was teetering on the edge of something that could shatter at any moment. The next evening, Charlotte found herself at another event, another extravagant gala filled with guests who barely noticed her presence. Victor was in his element, charming, smiling, making deals, but Charlotte felt like a ghost drifting among them. She couldn't help but feel the weight of Julian's presence everywhere she turned. Every glance, every fleeting interaction made her feel like he was watching her, pulling her deeper into a world she didn't understand but couldn't resist. And then, as if he had been waiting for the perfect moment, Julian appeared. She was standing near the bar, nursing a glass of champagne when he walked into the room, his eyes immediately locking onto hers across the crowded space. For a moment, Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. There was something magnetic about him, something that drew her in, no matter how much she tried to fight it. He was dressed in a dark tailored suit that hugged his form in all the right places. His hair was slightly tousled, his jawline sharp as ever. But it wasn't just his appearance that affected her. It was the way he moved. He had a grace to him, a fluidity that made everyone around him seem ordinary. As he approached her, she tried to steady her breath, her pulse racing. "Charlotte?" Julian said, his voice low and smooth, as though he were the only one who mattered in the room. His gaze was unwavering, intense. "It's nice to see you again." She swallowed, trying to find the words to respond. "Julian, I didn't expect you to be here tonight." "I didn't expect to be here either," he replied with a small, knowing smile. "But sometimes the night has a way of pulling us exactly where we need to be, don't you think?" His words sent a shiver down her spine, and for a moment, Charlotte felt lost in the sea of people. There was no one else in the room but Julian. No one else but the two of them, locked in a quiet, dangerous dance. "What are you doing here?" Charlotte asked, her voice a little breathless. She couldn't help herself. He took a step closer, and she felt his presence wash over her, intoxicating and all-consuming. "What do you think I'm doing here, Charlotte?" he asked, his voice dropping even lower. "I'm here because I want to be near you." Her heart skipped a beat. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly, her pulse racing. "Victor Dash." "Victor isn't the one I'm interested in," Julian interrupted, his gaze intense and piercing. "You are, Charlotte. You always have been." Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him to leave, but the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't deny the truth. Julian had a hold on her, one that was far stronger than she was willing to admit. Before she could say anything else, Victor appeared at her side, his sharp eyes flicking between the two of them. His gaze darkened ever so slightly, a quiet tension hanging in the air. "I see you've met my brother," Victor said, his voice polite, but tinged with something colder. Charlotte's heart sank. She didn't know how to react, how to explain the flutter of guilt and excitement that had twisted inside her. "Julian," Victor said stiffly, "I'm sure Charlotte and I will need to catch up. Don't let us keep you." Julian held Victor's gaze for a moment before offering a small, almost amused smile. "Of course," he said, stepping back, but his eyes never left Charlotte. "It was good to see you both." As Julian walked away, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that things had just shifted in a way she could never undo. The attraction, the pull, was undeniable now. Julian was back in her life, and he wasn't going anywhere. Chapter 4. The Allure of Temptation. The next few days passed in a blur, the silence between Charlotte and Victor growing thicker with each passing hour. Their conversations were shallow, polite, as if they were strangers rather than a married couple. He was busy with business, and she was lost in her own thoughts that always seemed to return to Julian. Charlotte found herself avoiding their shared spaces, spending her afternoons in the garden or lost in books, anything to keep her mind occupied. But nothing worked. Her thoughts, her desires, always circled back to him. Julian. The tension was unbearable. She had never felt so drawn to someone, so consumed by the idea of them. It wasn't just the physical attraction, though. That was undeniable. It was something deeper, something darker, a pull she couldn't resist. That evening, after dinner, Victor was out with clients again, leaving Charlotte alone in their penthouse. She wandered aimlessly through the spacious rooms, her mind heavy with thoughts she couldn't shake. She was tired of pretending, tired of the charade, and yet she couldn't bring herself to stop. As if on cue, the doorbell rang. Charlotte's heart leapt in her chest. She knew who it was before she even opened the door. Julian. When she did, he stood there, his dark eyes locked onto hers with a dangerous intensity. "I couldn't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice a low, sensual whisper. "We need to talk, Charlotte." Her pulse quickened, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't try to fight the pull. She stepped aside to let him in, her breath shallow, her body alive with anticipation. Chapter 5. The Descent. As Julian stepped inside the penthouse, the door clicked shut behind him, and Charlotte felt a strange mix of exhilaration and dread. Her heart pounded in her chest, her pulse racing as she led him into the lavish living room. She could feel the weight of his presence pressing down on her, a force she was powerless to resist. "Do you want a drink?" Charlotte asked, her voice sounding far more casual than she felt. She turned toward the bar, her hands trembling as she reached for a bottle of wine. "No need," Julian said, his voice smooth, almost predatory. His eyes were locked on her every move, dark and intense. "I'm not here for a drink, Charlotte." The simple words sent a shiver through her, and Charlotte turned to face him. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but no words came. She felt caught in his web, paralyzed by the heat simmering between them. She knew she should stop this, that everything about the situation screamed danger. But the truth was, part of her didn't want to stop. Julian took a slow step toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. Each movement seemed deliberate, calculated, as though he knew the effect he had on her. "Why are you really here, Julian?" Charlotte asked, her voice a mixture of defiance and curiosity. She was trying, but failing, to regain control of the situation. His lips curled into a slight smile, though there was no humor in it. "You already know why I'm here." He closed the distance between them, stopping just a few feet away. "I'm here because you can't resist me any more than I can resist you." Charlotte swallowed hard, her breath quickening. "We can't do this," she whispered, almost pleading. "You're Victor's brother. This is wrong." Julian's eyes softened just slightly, but the fire behind them never dulled. "What's wrong about it, Charlotte? We both know that what we have isn't a typical attraction. It's something deeper, something more." His words struck a chord deep inside her. She had known it from the moment their eyes first locked. There was something between them neither of them could deny. But admitting it aloud, allowing herself to feel it, was something else entirely. She shook her head, stepping back, desperate to put some distance between them. "You don't know anything about me, Julian. You don't know what I've been through." "I know enough," he said, his voice low and intense. "I know that Victor doesn't deserve you, not the way I do." The words hit Charlotte like a blow, but they also sent a pulse of warmth through her. She hated herself for it, but she couldn't deny that part of her agreed with him. Her marriage to Victor had been one of convenience and practicality, but she had never felt truly loved by him. He was always distant, absorbed in his work, leaving her to play the role of the perfect wife, while his heart seemed to belong to someone else, someone who wasn't her. Julian took another step closer, and this time, Charlotte didn't step back. The air between them crackled with palpable tension. She could feel his breath against her skin, hear the steady beat of his heart matching her own. "You can fight it all you want, Charlotte," Julian murmured, his voice almost hypnotic. "But I know what you're feeling. I can see it in your eyes." Charlotte felt the heat rising in her chest, a swirl of emotions she couldn't control. She wanted to push him away, to stop this before it went any further. But the words wouldn't come. The temptation was too strong. She didn't want to fight it anymore. Before she could make another move, Julian's hand reached out, cupping her face gently as though savoring the moment. His thumb brushed over her lips, the lightest of touches, but it was enough to send a wave of heat rushing through her veins. "I can't stop thinking about you," he whispered. "Every second I'm not with you, it feels like torture." Charlotte's heart thudded in her chest, her body betraying her thoughts. "Julian, please." Her voice was barely audible now, a breathless plea she wasn't sure she even believed in herself. But Julian didn't answer with words. He answered with a kiss. It was soft at first, tentative, as if he were testing her resolve. His lips brushed against hers, a slow, lingering touch that sent a shock of heat through her body. For a moment, Charlotte hesitated, her mind screaming at her to pull away, to remember what was at stake. But then, as if on cue, the kiss deepened, and her resistance melted away. Her arms wrapped around his neck, drawing him closer, the heat between them growing exponentially. His hand slid down her back, pulling her against him, and she could feel the undeniable hardness of his body pressing against hers. The kiss was no longer tentative. It was urgent, passionate, a desperate expression of everything they had been holding back. Charlotte's mind was spinning, her body alive with a fire she had never felt before. She didn't know what was happening to her, didn't know how to stop it. All she knew was that, in this moment, nothing else mattered. Not her marriage, not Victor, not the lies they were both living. Just Julian. He pulled away for a breath, his forehead resting against hers. "You're mine now, Charlotte," he whispered, his voice rough with desire. "And I'm not going anywhere." The word sent a shiver through her, but for the first time in a long time, Charlotte didn't feel the need to escape. The temptation was all-consuming, and she had no desire to resist anymore. She closed her eyes, giving in to the pull that had been building inside her for days. Chapter 6. The Price of Desire. The next morning, Charlotte woke in the same bed she had shared with Victor for years, but everything felt different. The sheets felt colder, the air heavier, and the reality of the previous night hung like a dark cloud over her. She could still feel the lingering warmth of Julian's touch on her skin, his breath in her ear, the way his lips had claimed hers. She had given in to temptation, and now there was no going back. But as the morning light filtered through the blinds, Charlotte felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She was still married to Victor, still bound by the vows they had taken years ago. And yet, last night, she had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible. But was it truly betrayal? Or was it the truth finally breaking through? Truth buried beneath years of neglect and emotional distance. Charlotte sat up in bed, the tangled sheets wrapping around her legs. She ran a hand through her disheveled hair, her thoughts a swirl of guilt and desire. The sound of her phone vibrating on the nightstand broke the silence. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the name on the screen. Victor. For a moment she froze, unsure how to respond. But then she remembered what Julian had said. He wasn't going anywhere. Neither was she. With a deep breath, Charlotte answered the call, bracing herself for whatever came next. Later that day, Charlotte sat across from Victor at the grand dining table, her fingers lightly tracing the stem of her wine glass. The chandeliers overhead cast a golden glow, reflecting off the polished silverware, but the atmosphere felt cold, an unsettling chill hanging in the air. It was a quiet tension, the kind that pressed down on her like a weight. Victor cut into his filet mignon with calculated precision, his movements slow and deliberate. "You seem distant tonight, my love," he said, lifting his gaze to meet hers. "Something on your mind?" Charlotte forced a soft smile. "Just a long day. Nothing more." Victor tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that seemed to see through her. "You wouldn't be thinking about Julian, would you?" Her breath caught for a brief second, but she masked it with a sip of wine. "Should I be?" Victor smirked, swirling his glass. "It's just interesting, don't you think? The moment my brother reappears, you suddenly become distracted." Charlotte willed her heartbeat to steady. Julian's return affects you more than it does me. I thought you didn't care about him. Victor chuckled darkly. Care? Number. But I do find it fascinating. He vanishes for years, and now, out of nowhere, he's back. I can't help but wonder, why now? Charlotte met his gaze, careful not to betray the storm of emotions raging inside her. Maybe he just wanted to reconnect. Victor's expression turned cold, his eyes narrowing. Julian doesn't reconnect. He manipulates. He waits for the perfect moment to strike. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Tell me, Charlotte, what exactly has he promised you? A chill ran down her spine. You speak as if he's some kind of threat. Victor exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You don't know him the way I do. He took a slow sip of his drink before adding, Julian Carter is a mistake that should have been erased a long time ago. Charlotte's grip on her glass tightened. There was no mistaking the venom in his tone. This wasn't just hatred. It was a warning. She realized then, with terrifying clarity, that Julian wasn't just fighting for love. He was fighting for survival. And now, so was she. Chapter 7. The Choice. The phone call was brief. Victor's voice, calm and businesslike as always, offered little more than the usual pleasantries. He mentioned that he'd be late again. Another late-night meeting with clients that wouldn't end until after midnight. The tone of the conversation felt hollow, detached, like a rehearsed script. Charlotte listened absent-mindedly, her mind still clouded with the memory of Julian's touch, the weight of the kiss that had rocked her world. She barely heard the last few words Victor spoke before he ended the call with a quick, I'll be home later. Don't wait up. It wasn't the first time he'd been away for the night. In fact, it had become routine. But for the first time, the emptiness of their marriage felt suffocating. Charlotte set the phone down and stared at her reflection in the mirror across the room. She hardly recognized the woman staring back at her. Her lips were still swollen from Julian's kiss, and her eyes, once full of reserve, now held an unspoken hunger, an ache she didn't know how to silence. She ran her fingers through her hair and sighed. The events of last night were playing out in her mind. Each moment of passion, each touch, each stolen kiss. They had been reckless, yes, but in a way, it felt like freedom. Freedom from a life she had been trapped in. A life that had stifled her desires and needs for far too long. But it wasn't just about freedom. It was about Julian. And the more she thought about him, the more she understood. This wasn't just physical attraction. There was something deeper between them. Something that went beyond what either of them could control. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. She turned to find Julian, standing in the doorway of her bedroom. A quiet confidence radiating from him as he leaned against the frame, his arms crossed. You're still here, Charlotte said, the words almost coming out as a question. She hadn't expected him to stay. In fact, she had convinced herself that what had happened last night was nothing more than a fleeting moment, a mistake that would soon be forgotten. But Julian wasn't the type of man to walk away so easily. I'm not going anywhere, Charlotte, Julian replied, his voice steady, yet full of intent. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. Not until you understand that what happened last night wasn't just some fleeting mistake. It's the beginning of something much bigger. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat as his words sank in. She should have pushed him away. should have told him this was wrong. But as his gaze locked with hers, she couldn't bring herself to say it. "I don't need a reminder of what happened," she finally said, her voice low, almost unsure. She took a step back, though she knew it was pointless. The air between them was charged, thick with unspoken desire. "You don't," Julian agreed, his eyes never leaving hers. He took another step closer, his presence overwhelming. "But you need to understand something. What happened last night wasn't just about a kiss. It was about us, Charlotte. It was about everything we've both been too afraid to admit." Charlotte's chest tightened at his words. She wanted to argue, to deny everything, but the truth was too powerful to ignore. The truth was staring her in the face, and it was Julian. Everything in her was screaming to step away, to run, but she couldn't. She didn't want to. He reached for her then, his hand brushing lightly over her arm, sending a bolt of electricity through her. "I don't want to play games, Charlotte," he whispered, his lips hovering just above hers. "I want you, and I'm not leaving until I have you." Her heart hammered in her chest as his words sank in. The temptation was unbearable, the pull between them too strong to ignore. I don't know what I'm doing," Charlotte admitted, her voice trembling. "You don't have to know," Julian replied softly. "You just have to let yourself feel it." And before she could respond, his lips were on hers again, fierce, demanding, claiming. The kiss was not the tentative, unsure kiss of the night before. It was filled with urgency, with heat. Charlotte's body responded instantly, as though every part of her had been waiting for this moment. She could feel Julian's hands on her, pulling her closer, his body heat radiating against hers. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. She could only feel. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathless, Charlotte's mind was spinning. She tried to collect herself, but her thoughts were a mess. The only thing she was sure of was that she was no longer in control. Her heart, her body, they had betrayed her. "I've never felt this way before," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hands were still trembling as she placed them on his chest. "I don't know what to do about it." "You don't have to do anything yet," Julian murmured. "Just let yourself be with me. Let yourself feel what's between us. We can figure the rest out later." Charlotte hesitated, her gaze flicking to the door, to the life she had built with Victor. She knew this was dangerous, knew that if anyone found out, it would destroy everything. But the feeling of Julian's hands on her, his lips against hers, was too intoxicating to fight. She closed her eyes, giving in to the moment. "What are we doing?" she asked softly. "We're making a choice," Julian replied, his voice low and full of promise. "A choice that we can't undo. And I won't let you regret it." Charlotte swallowed hard, her heart racing. The truth was, she didn't know if she would regret it. She only knew that, in that moment, nothing else mattered but the man standing before her. Julian, who had ignited a fire in her soul that she had never felt before. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken words, but neither of them moved. They were on the edge of something they couldn't turn away from. And as much as Charlotte wanted to pull away, to make things right again, she knew deep down that she was already too far gone. Chapter 8. The Storm Brewing. The days that followed were a blur. Charlotte's world had been irrevocably altered, and no matter how hard she tried to convince herself otherwise, she couldn't escape the truth of what she and Julian had begun. Every moment, without him, stretched into eternity, and every glance, every lingering touch, sent her heart into a frantic race. Victor had returned that night, just as he had promised, but their interactions felt mechanical. He kissed her on the cheek as he entered, asked about her day with little genuine curiosity, and then retreated to his study, lost in work until late into the night. Charlotte went through the motions: dinner, small talk, pretending everything was fine. But her mind constantly drifted back to Julian, the way he made her feel, the way he had taken what she didn't even realize she was capable of giving. Then, one evening, a message arrived that shattered the fragile calm she had been desperately clinging to. Julian's words flashed across her phone. "We need to talk. I can't wait any longer." A chill ran down her spine, but she couldn't ignore it. She knew exactly what he was asking, knew that the storm they had ignited was about to come crashing down, threatening to consume them both. Chapter 9. Crossroads. The moment Charlotte read Julian's message, a wave of panic washed over her, followed by an intense rush of excitement. The two conflicting emotions battled within her, but one thing was clear. She couldn't avoid this conversation any longer. She couldn't run from what had already begun. She glanced at Victor, seated at the dining table, absorbed in his laptop, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside her. It was as if he existed in a different reality, one that no longer held any power over her. She had always managed to play the role of the perfect wife, but now, the weight of her desires and the secrets she kept felt unbearable. Victor looked up from his work, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. "You okay?" he asked, his voice casual, though tinged with a subtle edge. He had noticed her distance lately, but hadn't pressed her for answers. "I'm fine," Charlotte replied quickly, her voice tighter than she intended. She forced a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just tired." Victor nodded, distracted. "I won't be home for dinner tomorrow. Another business dinner." He glanced at her briefly, but seemed uninterested in her response. Charlotte didn't reply, simply nodding before excusing herself, claiming she needed to check emails in her study. As soon as the door clicked shut behind her, she pulled out her phone again and reread Julian's message. "We need to talk. I can't wait any longer." Her hands shook as she typed a response. "When?" "Right now. I'm outside. We can talk here, or I can take you somewhere. Just don't make me wait any longer." Charlotte stared at the message for a long moment, her pulse quickening. She knew that once she stepped outside to meet Julian, there would be no turning back. All the emotions, all the forbidden desires she had tried to suppress would be laid bare. But she couldn't keep hiding. She couldn't pretend the fire between them wasn't real. With a deep breath, she stood, her gaze lingering on the door to her study. She had a choice to make, a choice that would change everything. She grabbed her coat and walked out, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, echoing in the stillness of the house. Her heart pounded with each step. When she reached the front door, she hesitated for a moment, then opened it, stepping out into the night. Julian stood by the curb, hands in his pockets, his intense gaze locked onto hers. He was every bit as captivating as the first time she saw him. He didn't speak immediately, just took a step toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. "I thought you'd come," he said quietly, his voice low, as though it were meant for her alone. "You're finally here." Charlotte swallowed, her breath unsteady. "I didn't know if I could." "I knew you would," he replied with a Small, knowing smile. You couldn't resist. I'm not sure I want to, Charlotte admitted softly, her voice vulnerable. She couldn't deny it anymore. The way he made her feel, the way her body responded to him without question. Julian stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. You don't have to resist anymore, he murmured. You've been lying to yourself long enough. We both have. Her heart raced at his words. It was true, wasn't it? She had been lying to herself, pretending she could live in a marriage that had long since stopped fulfilling her, pretending that her feelings for Julian were just a fleeting desire, but she couldn't deny it any longer. She stepped closer to him, drawn in by the magnetic pull between them. What do you want from me, Julian? She whispered. What happens now? I want you, Charlotte. All of you. And what happens now? His fingers brushed her cheek, sending a jolt of electricity through her. What happens now is up to you. Charlotte stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. She thought of Victor, of their life together, the lies they'd told each other. But then her thoughts turned to Julian, his touch, his eyes, the fire between them that could never be extinguished. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. Good, Julian said, a soft smile curling at his lips. You should be, because this isn't going to be easy, Charlotte, but nothing worth having ever is. Charlotte closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. She had spent so long being afraid of her desires, afraid of facing the truth. But standing here with Julian, she realized that fear was the only thing that had been holding her back. When she opened her eyes, her gaze was steady. Then let's not be afraid anymore. Julian leaned in, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was raw and intense, filled with every ounce of the desire that had been building between them. Charlotte melted into him, her body responding as though it had always belonged to him. In that moment, there was no Victor, no past, no consequences, only Julian, only the pull of everything they had denied for so long. When they finally broke apart, Charlotte's heart raced, her body aching for more. She knew there was no going back, not now, not ever. Are you ready? Julian whispered, his voice dark and seductive. Charlotte nodded, her breath shallow, her pulse racing. Yes, I'm ready. Chapter 10. The Point of No Return. The decision had been made. There was no turning back now, no escaping the storm that was about to break. Charlotte felt as though her world had been irrevocably altered. Everything she thought she knew about herself was suddenly in question. Julian had sparked something deep inside her, a desire, a hunger that no one else could ever satisfy. And now, she couldn't deny it any longer. The moment Charlotte stepped into Julian's car, a heavy sense of finality settled over her. She glanced at him, her heart still pounding in her chest, and found him watching her with a knowing, almost predatory gaze. Julian wasn't just the man who had set her world on fire. He was now the architect of a storm she couldn't avoid. I didn't think it would happen like this, Charlotte said softly, her fingers gripping the seat beneath her as the car glided through the streets. She wasn't entirely sure where they were going, but she didn't need to ask. She had long since stopped questioning anything Julian did. She was beyond reason now, beyond questioning her decisions. Julian's eyes flicked toward her, a smirk tugging at his lips. You never thought you'd end up here? With me? Charlotte shook her head, unsure whether she was trying to convince him or herself. Number I thought I could keep pretending, that it would go away. Her voice faltered slightly, but she held her head high. I never thought you'd be the one to make me face the truth. Julian's expression softened, though there was still that unmistakable hunger in his eyes. You've always known, Charlotte. Deep down, you've always known. Her breath caught in her throat, the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy blanket. He was right. She had always known. The longing, the desire that had been bubbling beneath the surface of her perfect life had never faded. And Julian had been the spark that set it all aflame. The car turned onto a quiet, tree-lined street, and Charlotte's heart skipped a beat as they pulled into a private driveway. The mansion in front of her was sleek and modern, with expansive windows and dark stone, exuding a cold elegance. She hadn't seen this place before. This wasn't part of the world she had built with Victor. This is where we can talk, Julian said, cutting the engine and stepping out of the car. Charlotte hesitated before following him, her legs weak beneath her. She watched him move with practiced ease, like a man used to getting exactly what he wanted. He opened the door to the house and gestured for her to enter. The interior was just as stunning as the exterior. High ceilings, minimalist furniture, the space cold, yet undeniably stylish. It felt like a place built for seduction, a place where the only thing that mattered was the hunger between them. Julian turned to face her as the door clicked shut behind them, the silence now thick with anticipation. I know this is dangerous, Charlotte whispered, her voice hoarse. She took a tentative step forward, closer to him, her eyes searching his for any sign of hesitation. But all she saw was hunger, raw and untamed, mirroring her own. What are we doing, Julian? Are you just using me? He shook his head slowly, as though the very idea offended him. I'm not using you, Charlotte. I'm giving you what you've wanted all along, what we've both wanted. Charlotte could feel the heat between them rising, thick and suffocating. You don't understand, she said, her voice breaking. Victor is my husband. This isn't just about us. It's about everything. My life, my reputation. I know what's at stake, Julian replied, stepping closer until there were mere inches between them. He reached up, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers grazing her skin. But maybe what's at stake isn't what you think. Maybe what you've built is the cage that's been keeping you from truly living. Charlotte's chest tightened at his words, a raw, unfamiliar truth taking root. Maybe he was right. Her life had been a carefully curated image, a perfect marriage that had long since stopped fulfilling her. But Julian made her feel something real, something she couldn't ignore, no matter how dangerous it was. He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. We don't have to talk about it yet. We don't have to decide anything. All I need is for you to let go. Let go of the fear. Let go of the consequences. Just be with me, Charlotte. His words hung in the air between them, a promise and a dare all at once. Charlotte's heart thundered in her chest as the realization hit her. She didn't want to fight it anymore. She didn't want to run from what she was feeling, from the hunger that burned in her every time they were close. Without thinking, she closed the distance between them, her lips crashing against his in a kiss that was raw and desperate. All the emotions she had been holding back, fear, guilt, and undeniable desire, poured into that kiss. Julian responded with equal intensity, his hands pulling her closer as if he couldn't get enough. When they finally broke apart, their breathing heavy and ragged, Charlotte could feel the heat still swirling between them, an undeniable force drawing them together. "This isn't just about passion, is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is about something more." Julian's eyes darkened, his gaze sending a shiver down her spine. "It's about everything, Charlotte," he said softly. "It's about what we've been too afraid to face, the love we've both been denying." Charlotte's chest tightened at his words. Love. Was it really love? Or was it the desperate need for something more, something real that she had never found in her marriage with Victor? She didn't have the answers, not yet. But in this moment, with Julian standing in front of her, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't walk away. Not now. "I'm not ready to face everything," she said, her voice barely audible. "But I'm ready for this." Julian smiled, slow and satisfied, as if he knew exactly what she meant. He didn't need to say anything. He simply took her hand and led her deeper into the house, where the boundaries between them would be pushed even further, and the game they had begun would move into its next, more dangerous stage. Chapter 11. The Reckoning. Back at the Sinclair mansion, the storm had already begun, and neither Charlotte nor Julian could foresee the devastating consequences that would unfold. What they didn't realize was that as they played their dangerous game of desire, the truth was closing in on them, faster than they could ever have imagined. The city outside was muffled by the thick walls of Julian's home, creating an isolation that made the rest of the world feel distant and irrelevant. Charlotte could barely hear her own thoughts over the pounding of her heart, yet there was something oddly soothing about the silence. Julian was just steps away, but in that moment, it felt as though he was the only thing that mattered. She watched him move around the room, gathering items they might need for the night. But Charlotte wasn't focused on the future. Her mind was in turmoil, spinning with questions she hadn't allowed herself to ask until now. "What am I doing?" her mind whispered, the guilt already creeping in. "Victor doesn't deserve this. I don't deserve this." But Julian's touch, his presence, was like a drug she couldn't resist. She wanted to hate him for making her feel this way, for tearing her apart from the inside. But there was something magnetic about him, something irresistible, that made her question everything she thought she knew about herself. Julian turned, catching her gaze. "You're quiet," he said, his voice low and expectant. "What are you thinking?" Charlotte opened her mouth to respond, but stopped herself. What was she thinking? Was she really considering leaving Victor? Could she destroy the life she had worked so hard to build? Could she turn her back on the man who had given her everything, except the one thing she needed most? Her eyes locked with Julian's, and she could see the fire still burning in him. I'm confused," she said honestly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. He moved closer, closing the distance between them in one smooth motion. "I understand," he said softly, his fingers brushing her arm. "But you know the truth, Charlotte. You've always known." She flinched at the truth in his words. She had always known. She had known that something was missing, something deeper than mere attraction, pulling her toward him. But she had buried it under layers of duty and obligation. She had convinced herself for so long that a life of luxury and security could fill the void in her heart. But Julian had shattered that illusion. Now, the cracks were too large to ignore. He cupped her face, gently tilting her chin so their eyes met again. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for," he said softly, his thumb grazing her lower lip. "But you deserve more than this life. You deserve someone who will make you feel everything you've been denying. Someone who won't make you settle." She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, the weight of his words settling deep within her. "Do I deserve more?" "Victor doesn't make you feel alive, Charlotte," Julian continued, his voice a whisper against her skin. "He doesn't make your heart race. He doesn't make you feel like this." He kissed her gently, almost tenderly, but it was a kiss full of need, of longing, of promises neither of them could yet keep. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. She pulled back slightly, shaking her head. I can't just throw it all away. Victor is my husband, Julian. We built this life together. And look at what it's become." Julian's voice was sharp, insistent. "Is this really the life you want? A marriage of convenience, of appearances, or do you want something more? Something real?" His words struck her like a lightning bolt, and for a moment, the ground beneath her seemed to tremble. She could feel everything she had built crumbling around her. The perfect marriage, the perfect life. Was it all just an illusion? She opened her eyes and met Julian's gaze, the truth sitting heavily in her chest. He's right. I don't know if I can walk away from everything I've built, she whispered, her voice trembling. Then don't walk away, Julian said, his eyes fierce. You don't have to walk away from everything. You just have to choose what you want, who you want. I'm not asking you to abandon your life. I'm asking you to live it, to feel it, to not let fear control your decisions anymore. Charlotte bit her lip, uncertainty swirling within her. Julian was offering her a path she hadn't considered, one that would force her to confront every fear, every doubt she had ever had. But deep inside her heart, something couldn't ignore him, couldn't ignore the yearning that had been buried for so long. Before she could respond, the shrill ring of a phone shattered the tension in the room. Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. It was her phone. She glanced at the screen, and her stomach dropped when she saw the name. Victor. For a moment, she stood frozen, her mind racing. She could ignore it, avoid the conversation. She could continue living in the world Julian was offering her, a world that seemed so much more alive, more thrilling than anything Victor could ever give her. But the reality of her situation crashed in on her. The life she had spent years building wasn't something she could just toss aside. Could she really walk away from the man who had been her partner, the man who had given her security, wealth, and everything she had been taught to want? Answer it, Julian said quietly, sensing her hesitation. You don't have to choose anything right now, but you do need to confront the truth. Charlotte took a shaky breath, her fingers hovering over the phone before she finally pressed the green button to answer. Charlotte? Victor's voice crackled through the phone, tight with something she couldn't quite place. Where are you? I've been trying to reach you all evening. I'm out, Charlotte said, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. She glanced up at Julian, who watched her with an unreadable expression. I needed some time alone. Victor didn't respond right away, his silence thick with unspoken questions. Alone. With who, Charlotte? His voice had dropped, a trace of suspicion creeping in. Charlotte's pulse quickened, her eyes darting to Julian. She wondered for a split second if Victor knew, if he had suspected all along. But she didn't have time to dwell on it. Julian reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, in a silent reassurance that everything would be fine. "I'm just thinking, Victor," she said, forcing her voice to sound calm and composed. "I'll be home soon." There was a long pause, and when Victor finally spoke again, his words were clipped. "All right, but don't take too long. We need to talk." Charlotte's heart pounded in her chest. She knew this conversation was far from over, but for now, she had escaped. For now, she had Julian, and that was all that mattered. "I'll be back soon," she said, ending the call quickly. When she set the phone down, Julian moved closer, his lips brushing against her ear. "That's the first of many conversations you'll have to have with him," he murmured, his voice thick with promise. "But right now, we're not thinking about him. We're thinking about us." Charlotte's breath caught. She had already made her choice, and she knew, deep down, that the consequences would be far greater than anything she could ever imagine. But as Julian kissed her again, pulling her deeper into his world, she couldn't bring herself to care. Chapter 12. The Web Tightens. Victor's suspicions were now fully awake, and the web of lies, deceit, and passion Charlotte had become entangled in was tightening with every passing moment. Yet, with Julian by her side, she couldn't help but wonder, would it be worth it? Would the storm they were courting bring everything crashing down, or would it set them free? The answer was closer than she realized. The following days blurred together in a haze of half-truths, stolen moments, and mounting pressure. Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that everything was slipping further out of her control. Her life had always been meticulously organized, the picture-perfect facade she and Victor had carefully crafted. But now that facade was crumbling, piece by piece. Every time Victor's gaze lingered on her, she saw the suspicion creeping into his eyes. She felt the weight of his watchfulness, the subtle changes in his behavior. He was noticing more, asking more questions, reading between the lines of her every response. She knew he felt that something was off, though he hadn't confronted her directly, yet. It was only a matter of time, but Charlotte couldn't stop herself. Every time she and Julian shared a secret smile, every time their fingers brushed when no one was looking, she felt the weight of her decision becoming more real. She had chosen him. She had chosen to live in the moment, to embrace the fire between them, despite the consequences. It was intoxicating. Still, guilt gnawed at her. Victor hadn't done anything wrong, at least not directly. He had been a devoted husband, even if their marriage had become more of a formality than a relationship. He gave her everything, except the one thing she craved, passion. But could she really betray him? Could she destroy the life they had built together? There were moments when Charlotte would sit in their grand home, staring out the window at the city below, wondering if she was already too far gone. Could she ever go back to the life she had before? Every time she looked into Julian's eyes, those doubts slipped away, replaced by a burning desire to dive deeper into this reckless affair. He made her feel alive in ways she hadn't felt in years. And now, the game they were playing had become more dangerous than either of them had expected. Victor's suspicions reached their boiling point one night when Charlotte returned home later than usual. She had been out with Julian again, dining at one of the hidden spots Julian frequented, places away from prying eyes where they could share stolen moments without fear of being caught. But this time, When she entered their luxurious penthouse, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Victor stood in the middle of the living room, his back to her, staring out over the city. He didn't even turn when he heard her enter. "You've been gone longer than usual," he said, his voice flat, but with an edge to it. Charlotte froze for a moment, her heart skipping a beat. He knows, she thought. He knows something. She cleared her throat, trying to sound nonchalant. "I lost track of time. Sorry. I didn't mean to worry you." Victor finally turned around, his eyes narrowed, studying her with a calculating gaze. "It's not just about time, Charlotte. It's about where you've been, who you've been with." Charlotte's pulse quickened. She wanted to deny it, to lie, to hide behind the mask she had perfected over the years. But something in his voice, something cold and piercing, told her the time for pretending was over. "I was with some friends," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, but she could see the way his eyes searched hers, the way he was dissecting every word, every tiny flicker of emotion. He wasn't buying it. Victor took a step closer to her, his presence looming. "You don't have to lie to me, Charlotte. I know you've been meeting Julian." Charlotte's heart stopped. Her mind raced for a response, but nothing came. She had no words to deny it, no excuses to offer. She had been caught. Julian's name hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Victor didn't wait for her to respond. "I don't know what's going on between you two, but I'm not stupid," he said, his voice hardening. "You've been different lately, cold, distant." I'm not distant," she stammered, panic rising in her chest. "Victor, Don't lie to me, Charlotte," he interrupted. His voice was low, a dangerous undercurrent running through it. "I know something's happening, and I'm not going to pretend I don't see it." The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Charlotte could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on her, suffocating her. But she couldn't tell him. Not now. Not like this. Victor stepped back, his face hardening, a mask of anger and betrayal forming. "If you think I'm just going to sit back and let you ruin everything we've built, you're wrong," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "I want the truth, Charlotte. No more lies." Charlotte felt the walls closing in on her. The perfect life she had carefully constructed was disintegrating in front of her eyes. And Julian, the man who had made her feel everything she'd been missing, was at the center of it all. "I need to think," Charlotte whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know what to do." Victor's gaze didn't soften. If anything, it grew colder. "Think all you want, Charlotte, but don't think I'll let you get away with this. You'll have to face the consequences sooner or later." The words stung, but they were nothing compared to the storm brewing inside her. She had never felt more trapped in her life, torn between her past and her future, between loyalty and desire, between the life she had and the one she craved. Later that night, Charlotte found herself at the window again, staring out at the city that had always seemed so beautiful, so comforting. But tonight, it felt distant, foreign. Her entire world was shifting, and she wasn't sure she could keep up. Julian's voice echoed in her mind, a promise that both terrified and exhilarated her. "You deserve more than this life. You deserve someone who will make you feel alive." But she wasn't sure she could have both, not without destroying everything. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Victor standing there, his posture stiff, his face set in an unreadable expression. "I'm not going to fight with you, Charlotte," he said quietly. "But I'm done pretending I don't know what's going on. We need to talk. And when we do, you better have the truth." Charlotte swallowed, her throat tight. She knew this conversation was inevitable. And no matter how much she wanted to run to Julian, to escape the consequences of her actions, she knew she couldn't. Not yet. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Okay, Victor. We'll talk." Chapter 13. The Fallout. The truth had finally caught up with Charlotte. There was no more hiding, no more pretending. The consequences were here, and she would have to face them, whether she was ready or not. The game they had started was about to take a dangerous turn. Charlotte was beginning to understand that the price of passion might be higher than she had ever imagined. The night dragged on, its weight sinking deep into Charlotte's bones. Victor stood at the door for a long moment, his presence like an unspoken challenge. He didn't wait for her to respond, didn't need her to. He simply turned and walked down the hall to the study, where he spent most of his late nights. Charlotte stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She should follow him. She should go to him, beg for forgiveness, confess everything, and try to salvage the wreckage of their marriage. But there was a different kind of fire inside her now, a fire that hadn't burned so deeply before. Julian's kiss, his words, they had awakened something in her, a desire for more. But was it too late to turn back? With a shaky breath, Charlotte followed Victor, the weight of her decision pressing heavily on her chest. She knocked lightly on the door before stepping in. Victor didn't look up from the papers scattered across his desk, but the tension in his posture was unmistakable. He didn't need to say anything. His anger was palpable in the air around them. "Sit down," he finally said, his voice cold and hard. Charlotte complied, sitting across from him, her fingers nervously twisting in her lap. She opened her mouth, but no words came. What could she say? What could she possibly say to make this better? Victor finally looked up at her, his gaze sharp and piercing, filled with a quiet fury. "I know what's been going on, Charlotte, and don't try to lie to me. I saw the way you looked at him, the way you've been acting. You can't hide it anymore." Her stomach twisted, a deep ache settling in her chest. She had hoped, no, prayed, that Victor wouldn't confront her, that they could pretend everything was fine. But now, the truth was out in the open. Victor, Her voice faltered, the words caught in her throat. She had never been good at deception, but now she was forced to face the truth she had been running from. "I asked you where you were the other night, Charlotte," Victor continued, his voice quieter, but no less intense. "And you lied to my face. You don't get to lie to me anymore." Tears pricked the back of her eyes, but Charlotte fought them back. She couldn't break down in front of him, not now, not when everything was hanging by a thread. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never meant for it to go this far." Victor shook his head slowly, disappointment clouding his expression. "But it did, didn't it? You let it go too far. And now we're here. I deserve to know why. Why him? Why Julian?" Charlotte swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. She looked down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. She wanted to tell him the truth, but the truth was so messy, so tangled in emotion and guilt that she could hardly untangle it in her mind. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She felt like a stranger in her own life, trapped in a web of lies and forbidden desires. Victor. She hesitated, then took a deep breath, her resolve firming. I've been so lost in this life, in everything you've given me, but I've been so empty. And Julian, he makes me feel things I haven't felt in a long time, things I didn't even know I was missing, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't pretend that what we have, what we've built, is enough. Victor's eyes widened, a mix of shock and hurt flashing across his face. Instead of speaking, he leaned back in his chair, processing her words in silence. His stillness was louder than any outburst he could have made. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating, like the air before a storm. Charlotte wanted to apologize, to say she was sorry for the pain she had caused, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she waited for his response, knowing this was the moment everything changed. Victor finally broke the silence. I gave you everything, Charlotte. Everything. A life of wealth, security, comfort. Everything you could possibly need. His voice cracked, though he quickly regained his composure. And you betrayed me. For him. For Julian. I never meant to hurt you, she whispered, her heart aching with every word. But I can't pretend anymore, Victor. I can't lie to myself or to you. I've fallen for him. Victor's gaze turned icy as he stood abruptly, pacing across the room. So that's it then. You've made your choice. I haven't, Charlotte began, but Victor cut her off, his anger flaring. I know what you've chosen, Charlotte, he snapped. And don't sit there and pretend you haven't made up your mind. You think you can just walk away from me, from this life we've built? You think you can destroy everything we've worked for? Everything I've worked for? Charlotte opened her mouth to respond, but the sharpness of his words silenced her. He was right about one thing. Everything had changed. She had crossed a line she couldn't come back from, no matter how much she wanted to. I never wanted to destroy you, Victor, but She stopped herself, unable to finish the thought. The guilt choked her. Victor paused, his back to her. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. You've already destroyed it all, Charlotte. I don't know how we come back from this. You've made your choice. I don't want to lose you, Charlotte said, her voice trembling with emotion. But I can't be who you want me to be anymore. Victor slowly turned to face her, his eyes dark with unshed anger and pain. Then, I guess it's over. His words were final, their weight sinking deep into her chest. He didn't wait for her to respond. He simply turned and walked out of the room, leaving Charlotte alone in the silence of her own guilt and despair. Chapter 14. The Breaking Point. Victor's words lingered in the air long after he left the room, leaving Charlotte feeling torn between two worlds. One was the life she had known, safe, secure, and comfortable. The other was a dangerous affair with Julian, a path filled with passion, lies, and uncertainty. A life that threatened to consume her. But there was no turning back now. The breaking point had arrived. As much as she wished to salvage what was left, deep down, she knew the damage had already been done. She was living with the consequences now, and there was no escaping the storm that was coming. Charlotte sat in the dimly lit study, the silence pressing down on her like a suffocating weight. The confrontation with Victor had shaken her, but not because she regretted her actions. No, the truth had finally surfaced, and she could no longer hide behind the illusion of her marriage. But what now? Her hands trembled as she reached for a glass of wine that Victor had abandoned on the table. She took a slow sip, the bitterness burning her throat. She had fought so hard to suppress her feelings, to keep her desire for Julian buried beneath duty and loyalty. But the moment she crossed the line, the moment their lips first met, there had been no going back. A soft vibration in her pocket snapped her from her thoughts. Her heart skipped when she saw Julian's name. Julian. Did he hurt you? Her breath caught. She glanced toward the hallway where Victor had disappeared only moments ago. The air still carried his anger, thick and suffocating. But no, he hadn't hurt her. Not physically, at least. Charlotte. Number. But he knows. Everything. The 3 dots flickered as Julian typed. Julian. Then it's time. Her pulse quickened. Time for what? She already knew the answer. Julian had always wanted her to choose, wanted her to walk away from the life she shared with Victor and step into the one he promised. Freedom, passion, love. But would it ever be that simple? A knock at the door startled her, and she quickly shoved her phone away. Charlotte. Victor's voice called from the hallway, controlled but firm. We need to talk. Again. She closed her eyes briefly before standing, smoothing her dress with steady hands. The reckoning wasn't over yet. Victor stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, the glow from the flames casting shadows over his hardened features. I didn't want to believe it. He began, his voice eerily calm. I thought maybe I was imagining things. Maybe you were just restless. But now I see it. His gaze locked onto hers. You love him. Charlotte swallowed hard. She could lie, try to salvage what was left of their marriage. But why? It was over. I do. The words hung in the air like a dagger between them. Victor's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. But he didn't explode. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. So what now? His voice was laced with something dark, something unpredictable. You think you'll just run to him, start a new life with my brother and pretend this never happened? She hesitated. She hadn't planned that far ahead. She had been so consumed by the secrecy, the thrill, the stolen moments, that she hadn't fully considered what came next. I don't know, she admitted. But I know I can't stay in this marriage, Victor. A bitter laugh escaped him. Of course. Because Julian makes you feel something, right? He turned away, running a hand through his hair before fixing her with a cold stare. You do realize what he is, don't you, Charlotte? She frowned. What do you mean? Victor took a slow step toward her, his eyes narrowing. You think he's back for you? That this whole thing is about love? He scoffed. Julian's hated me for years, and you... He gestured at her. You were just the perfect weapon. Charlotte flinched. That's not true. Isn't it? Victor walked to his desk and pulled open a drawer, retrieving a small black folder. He tossed it onto the coffee table between them. Open it. Her hands shook as she reached for the folder, flipping it open. Inside were old newspaper clippings, financial records, and, her breath hitched, a photograph of Julian standing outside a courthouse. Her mind raced as she skimmed the documents. Julian's past had always been a mystery, but now, here before her, was a glimpse of the man she barely knew. He was arrested, Victor said, watching her closely. For fraud, embezzlement. He's not the man you think he is, Charlotte. And I guarantee you, he's not here for love. Charlotte felt the ground beneath her shift. She didn't want to believe it. Julian had shared bits and pieces about his struggles, how Victor had abandoned him, how he had fought to make a name for himself without his brother's wealth. But fraud, lies. She closed the folder, her heart hammering. This doesn't change the way I feel. Victor smirked, but there was no humor in it. Then you're a fool. Charlotte pushed back the rising fear in her chest. Julian loved her. She knew he did. Whatever past he had, it didn't change what they shared. Did it? Victor's voice dropped, dangerously soft. You want to walk away from me, Charlotte? Fine, but don't think for a second. I'll make it easy for you. He stepped closer, his presence suffocating. And when Julian Carter finally shows his true colors, don't say I didn't warn you. Charlotte lifted her chin, willing her emotions to stay in check. You don't control me, Victor. No, he murmured, his gaze searing into hers. But I do control what happens next. A chill ran down her spine. Victor wasn't going to let her go without a fight. And suddenly, Charlotte realized this was far from over. This was just the beginning of the war. Chapter 15. Lies Unraveling. Charlotte left Victor's study feeling more lost than she ever had before. His words clung to her, poisoning her thoughts with doubt and fear. As she entered her bedroom, her phone buzzed once more. Julian, meet me. Now. Her heart pounded in her chest. She knew she should demand answers. She should ask him about the folder, about the accusations, about whether Victor's claims held any truth. But right now, she needed him. Without a second thought, she grabbed her coat and slipped out of the house, stepping into the cold night. She had made her choice, but deep down, she had no idea if it was the right one. Charlotte drove through the darkened streets, gripping the steering wheel tightly as Victor's words repeated in her mind. Julian has hated me for years, and you were just the perfect weapon. You think he's back for love. He's back for revenge. She shook her head, trying to push away the doubt creeping in. Victor was manipulative, always had been. He was trying to turn her against Julian because he couldn't stand the thought of losing. But what if, just what if, there was some truth in what he'd said? The thought made her stomach twist in a way that nothing else had. When she pulled into the secluded parking lot of a small boutique hotel, she saw Julian leaning against his car, hands shoved into the pockets of his dark coat. His eyes met hers as she approached, his expression tense. Charlotte, he breathed, stepping toward her. The moment she was within reach, he cupped her face, his thumbs grazing her cheekbones. Are you okay? Did he? He didn't hurt me, she whispered, though Victor's words had cut deeper than anything physical. Julian studied her closely, sensing the hesitation in her voice. Something's wrong. She stepped back slightly, wrapping her arms around herself. He told me things, Julian, about you. His jaw clenched, eyes narrowing. Like what? She took a breath, steadying herself. He showed me records, articles, proof that you... She paused, swallowing the weight of it. That you were arrested for fraud, embezzlement. The air between them went thick with silence. Julian's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes, A shadow, something dark. Finally, he let out a slow breath. I was never convicted, he said carefully. Her pulse quickened. That wasn't a denial. But you were arrested, she pressed. Julian, tell me the truth. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing for a moment before turning back to her. It's complicated. Charlotte's frustration spiked, then uncomplicated. Julian met her gaze, sighing. Fine. I was arrested. Years ago. But it wasn't fraud the way Victor made it sound. It was a setup. A setup? She frowned, confusion and doubt mixing. I was working for a startup. I helped manage accounts. I trusted the wrong people. And when money went missing, they needed someone to blame. That someone was me. His voice hardened. Victor could have helped me. He could have used his power, his resources to clear my name. But he didn't. Instead, he let me drown. Charlotte searched his eyes, trying to read him. And you never took a dime? His lips pressed together in a tight line. Number. But I learned the hard way that trust is dangerous. She wanted to believe him. She needed to. But the doubt still gnawed at her. Tell me something else, she said quietly. Why did you come back, Julian? His gaze darkened, and his voice dropped. For you. Her heart clenched. And revenge. Julian was silent for a beat too long. Finally, he reached for her hand, his grip warm, steady. I won't lie to you, Charlotte. When I came back, I wanted to destroy him. I wanted him to lose everything the way I did. Her throat tightened. But then I saw you, he murmured. And suddenly, revenge didn't matter anymore. All I wanted was us. Tears burned at the back of her eyes. She wanted to believe him more than anything. Charlotte, he whispered, lifting her chin so she couldn't look away. You have to trust me, do you? She hesitated. Victor's warning still echoed in her mind. When Julian Carter finally shows his true colors, don't say I didn't warn you. But when she looked into Julian's eyes, she saw the man who had reignited a fire in her, the one who made her feel alive again. And so, despite the swirling doubt, she made her choice. I trust you. Julian exhaled, relief flooding his features. He pulled her into his arms, pressing his lips to her forehead. But as she melted into him, a single thought haunted her. What if I'm wrong? Chapter 16. Dangerous Games. Charlotte woke the next morning, tangled in Julian's sheets, his arm draped protectively over her waist. The soft light of dawn filtered through the hotel curtains, casting everything in a warm, golden glow. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to forget the chaos waiting just beyond these walls. But reality had a way of reasserting itself. She gently slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb Julian. Reaching for her phone on the nightstand, she saw dozens of missed calls, Victor, her assistant, and a few unfamiliar numbers. Her stomach twisted as she opened a message from Victor. Victor, you've made your choice. Now you'll live with the consequences. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She glanced over at Julian, still asleep, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. Victor wasn't a man who let go easily. And now, Charlotte had everything to lose. Chapter 17. The Cost of Choices. Charlotte dressed quickly, her hands trembling as she buttoned her blouse. Victor's message echoed in her mind, a relentless warning. You've made your choice. Now you'll live with the consequences. She glanced at Julian, still asleep beside her, his breathing steady and calm. He looked peaceful, untouched by the storm that was about to consume them both. But Charlotte knew better. This wasn't a love story. It was a war. And she had just fired the first shot. Slipping into her heels, she grabbed her purse and moved toward the door. She needed space, a moment to think, to breathe. She needed to understand the true meaning of Victor's threat. But just as her hand touched the doorknob, Julian stirred. Leaving so soon? His voice was thick with sleep, but his dark eyes were wide open, alert. Charlotte hesitated, guilt crawling up her spine. I just need some air. Julian propped himself up on one elbow, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Did he text you? She hesitated for a moment. Lying wasn't an option anymore. Yes. His expression darkened. What did he say? Charlotte swallowed, feeling the weight of his words. That I'll live with the consequences of my choice. Julian swung his legs over the edge of the bed and sat up, his jaw tight. He was silent for a moment, then spoke with a cold edge in his voice. He's not bluffing. A chill swept through her. What do you think he'll do? Julian's eyes hardened. Victor doesn't just punish people. He destroys them. Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. What does that mean for us? Julian stood and walked toward her, moving with slow, deliberate steps. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumb brushing gently over her cheek. It means we need to be ready for anything. We can't afford to be unprepared. Her breath caught in her throat. Julian, I don't want to lose you. You won't. His lips brushed against hers, soft and lingering. But we have to be smart. Charlotte closed her eyes, pressing into him, seeking comfort. But even in his arms, the weight of uncertainty hung heavy. She wanted to believe that their love was stronger than anything Victor could throw at them, that Julian could protect her. But deep down she knew. Victor never lost. And if she wasn't careful, neither she nor Julian would escape unscathed. Chapter 18. Victor Strikes. Charlotte returned to the Sinclair estate later that afternoon. Every step toward the grand front doors heavier than the last. The house felt foreign now, like an enemy lying in wait to devour her whole. The moment she stepped inside, Victor was there. He leaned casually against the marble staircase, arms crossed, a slow, mocking smile playing at his lips. Decided to come home after all. Charlotte lifted her chin, refusing to show weakness. We need to talk. Victor pushed off the railing, moving toward her with the self-assurance of a man who still believed he controlled her. Oh, I agree. There's so much to discuss. She squared her shoulders. What do you want? Victor tissed, circling her like a predator. That's the wrong question, sweetheart. He stopped in front of her, his voice lowering to a menacing whisper. You should be asking what I've already done. A knot of dread twisted in her stomach. Victor Dash. He smirked, pulling his phone from his pocket. A few swipes later, he held the screen up to her. Her blood froze. It was an article. Julian Carter. A con man returns? The headline alone was damning, but the contents were worse. Details about his past arrest, accusations of new shady dealings, and the implication that he was using her to get access to Sinclair wealth. It was a public execution. Her hand shook as she looked up at Victor. "You did this." Victor slipped his phone back into his pocket, the smirk never leaving his face. "I warned you, Charlotte. You wanted to play dirty. Now you'll learn what it feels like to lose." Her world tilted. If Julian saw this, if the world saw this, "What have you done?" she whispered. Victor tilted his head, his voice cold. "You're mine, Charlotte. And if you think you can just run off with my pathetic excuse for a brother, you're more foolish than I thought." Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she wouldn't let them fall. "I hate you." Victor smiled, leaning in closer. "Hate me all you want, sweetheart. In the end, you'll realize there's no escaping me." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the silence, leaving Charlotte standing there, feeling shattered. Shaking, she pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Julian's number. It rang once, twice, then, "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." Her heart stopped. "Number! No, no, no!" She dialed again, her panic growing. Same response. Victor's words echoed in her mind. "You'll live with the consequences." Tears blurred her vision. Julian was gone. And this time, she had no idea if he would ever return. Chapter 19. Shattered Promises. Charlotte stood frozen in the grand foyer, her pulse thundering in her ears. The words, "no longer in service," replayed in her mind like an endless loop, each repetition tightening the grip of dread around her heart. Julian wouldn't just disappear. Not without a word. Not without a fight. She dialed again. Same response. Panic surged through her veins. She needed to find him, needed to know he was safe. But as she turned toward the door, Victor's voice stopped her in her tracks. "You won't find him." She spun around, fire in her eyes. "What did you do?" Victor simply smirked, hands in his pockets, every inch the untouchable billionaire. "I made sure he understood his place." Her stomach twisted. "Where is he?" Victor took a slow step forward. Julian always thought he could outplay me, that he could take what's mine and walk away unscathed. His smirk deepened. He was wrong. Charlotte's chest tightened. "Victor, if you heard him—" He laughed, low and cruel. "Relax, darling. I don't kill people." He leaned in, his voice dripping with venom. "But I bury them." Her breath hitched. "Where is he?" Victor tilted his head, a mocking glint in his eyes. "Gone. That's all you need to know." Rage flared inside her, but she knew Victor too well. He had planned this. Every move, every twist in this cruel game had been carefully orchestrated. Julian was gone, and Victor had made it happen. Her vision blurred with tears, but she fought them back, lifting her chin as her voice steadied. "This isn't over." Victor's smirk widened. "Oh, I'm counting on it." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, alone, heartbroken and seething with fury. But Charlotte Sinclair had one thing Victor had never accounted for. She had nothing left to lose, and that made her dangerous. Chapter 20. The Reckoning. Days passed, then a week, then 2. Julian was gone. No trace, no contact. It was as if He had vanished from existence. Victor carried on as if nothing had changed, hosting business meetings, attending events, maintaining the facade of the perfect billionaire mogul. And Charlotte? She was drowning in silence. Until the letter arrived. She found it one morning on her vanity. An elegant black envelope with only her name written on the front. No return address. No markings. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Charlotte, I had to leave. You have to forget me. Victor won. He always wins. I thought I could protect you, but I was wrong. The only way for you to be safe is for me to disappear. I love you. But this is goodbye. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she clutched the letter, her heart shattering all over again. This wasn't how it ended. Victor thought he had won, that he had destroyed the love she and Julian shared, that she would fall back in line, obedient and broken. But he had underestimated her. She wasn't going to walk away. She was going to burn it all down. With steady hands, she picked up her phone and dialed a number she never thought she'd use. It rang twice before a deep voice answered. I was wondering when you'd call. Charlotte inhaled sharply. I want to take Victor Sinclair down. A dark chuckle. Then let's get started. As she hung up, she wiped away her tears, her sorrow replaced by something colder, something lethal. Julian may have left, but this war was far from over. And when she was done, Victor Sinclair would regret ever thinking he could own her. The end, or is it just the beginning? Epilogue. The aftermath. Months had passed since that day, the day Charlotte had made the decision to take control of her own destiny, the decision that had ignited a chain of events that would change everything. The world knew Victor Sinclair as a billionaire mogul with the power to manipulate, control, and destroy anyone who dared cross him. But behind his carefully constructed empire, there was now a crack, one that Charlotte had made sure would widen with each passing day. It had been a slow burn at first, subtle moves, careful planning, and a meticulous dismantling of Victor's business dealings. But Charlotte had learned from the best. She had learned from the man she once thought was her greatest enemy. And she wasn't going to stop until she had exacted her revenge. Victor had underestimated her. He'd believed that once Julian was gone, she would crumble, that she would return to her life, broken and compliant. But Charlotte Sinclair had never been one to follow anyone's script. As for Julian, she still didn't know where he was. The months without him had been excruciating, but she couldn't afford to let that weakness rule her. She had to stay focused. She had to keep going. Every piece she moved, every connection she severed, brought her closer to Victor's downfall. Victor's empire was slipping through his fingers, and Charlotte could feel the weight of it on his shoulders. He was getting desperate, and desperation made people careless. The day came when the final blow landed. Charlotte stood in the conference room of Sinclair Enterprises, the building that had once been the symbol of Victor's power, the same room where he had made her feel small and insignificant, where he had told her she was nothing. Now, it was her turn to control the room. The doors opened, and Victor entered, his expression unreadable. His eyes briefly flickered over her, calculating, assessing. But even he couldn't deny the change. The woman standing before him wasn't the same naive, broken girl he had known. Charlotte stood tall, her resolve unshakable. Victor, she said, her voice steady, you've lost. A shadow passed over his face, but he quickly masked it with a cold smile. You think you've won? No, Charlotte replied, stepping closer. I've already won. You just don't know it yet. The silence between them hung heavy. The final piece had fallen into place. The scandal, the financial ruin, the quiet whispers of the truth being exposed. Victor Sinclair was finished. And as she watched the man who had once controlled her life crumble before her eyes, Charlotte knew there was only one thing left to do. She walked away. She didn't need to look back. The empire he had built with manipulation and deceit was no more. It had taken everything from her, but now it had nothing left. And as she stepped out of the building, the weight on her shoulders lifted. The burden of vengeance had been heavy, but it had set her free. The future was hers, and this time, no one would ever own her again. Thank you for listening to Beneath the Empire, written by James Sinclair. I hope you enjoyed Charlotte and Julian's journey through love, betrayal, and revenge.